Hello judges, thank you for taking the time to watch this. So the name of my project is The Effect of Social Isolation on the Popularity of Home-Based Hobbies and the Effect of those hobbies on depression levels during the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 pandemic was tough for a lot of people. Many studies showed that depression levels rose throughout the country. This is partly due to there being economic difficulties, but there's also lots of social isolation that made it worse. However, despite seeing this on the news, I myself didn't have much depression, and I actually had a good time that year. I had a lot of time off from school, I played outside, and I did new things. This led me to my project. I wondered, did my hobbies actually keep me from being depressed? To help design my project, I did a Google Trends search to search for things that my family did, such as eating sourdough bread or fostering pets, and I saw that other people were looking at the same things during the same time period. So, for my first question, which hobbies were the most prevalent during the initial lockdown of March to June 2020? I chose this particular time period because this is when most states had the bulk of their lockdown. Is interest in home-based hobbies representative of the degree of social isolation experienced by people residing in different states? In other words, does more isolation mean more hobbies? Do the states with higher social isolation have higher depression at first? Also, do home-based hobbies help to mitigate this depression on a long-term basis? Okay, so on to my hypothesis. Depression levels will correlate with indicators of social isolation. More lockdown time and lower mobility, so going out less, will correlate with higher depression. States with more isolation will see more stay-at-home hobbies. Pursuing more hobbies will lead to less depression. So, on to materials and methods. My first step in this project was to identify which hobbies were the most prevalent. To do this, I went onto Google Trends, and on their website, I selected the lockdown period of March to June 2020. However, not all of the results were relevant. For example, I got search terms such as 2020 election results. Stuff like that doesn't really have to do with hobbies. So to make the data specific to hobbies, I selected the following 5 categories: food and drink, arts and entertainment, hobbies and leisure, pets and animals, and beauty and fitness. Next, I identified which states searched these terms the most and least. The states that searched these terms the most were called the top 5 states by hobby, and the states that searched them the least, the bottom 5 states by hobby. Now that I'd identified the states that had the most and least hobbies, my next step was to look at the CDC's mandatory lockdown data. I found which states had the most mandated time in lockdown. However, now something unexpected occurred. Some states, even though they're largely isolated, had political issues with mandating lockdowns. So, in the data, they were appearing as zeros. That's when I decided to look at Descartes' lab's data on cellular mobility. This shows, through cellular data, how much people were actually moving about. After figuring out social isolation levels, next I determined depression levels in the selected states. I used data that I got from KFF that was originally gathered in the CDC's Household Pulse Survey. I looked at depression levels at different time periods. I looked at data from before the pandemic started and in stages throughout the pandemic. Next, I wanted to look at some possible confounding factors. I looked at Mental Health America's data to see if access to healthcare had changed over the course of the pandemic. I also looked to see if mobility patterns had changed. On to our results. So, let's see, from the final 5 categories, which hobbies were the most prevalent. They were yeast for baking, popular Google Doodle games, exotic Joe Tiger King, foster a dog, and quarantine workout. This is kind of interesting. Yeast for baking. I really enjoyed eating sourdough bread. My mom was baking all the time, and I remembered her talking about yeast. And popular Google Doodle games, I really liked playing those. Whenever I was bored, I'd just get on and I'd play them. Exotic Joe Tiger King. I heard my parents talking about Tiger King. I've never watched it, but my parents were talking about it all the time back then. Foster a dog. So I never fostered a dog, but we did foster a cat. And yeah. So quarantine workout. My mom made me run all the time, forced workouts. So yeah, that was my hobby. So this graph confirms that the selected search topics indeed peaked during the initial lockdown period of March 1st to June 30th, 2020. So this graph is very similar. It averaged all of the different search terms, and it also shows that all of these hobbies peaked during this specific time period. So this graph breaks down how each of the states ranked in search terms. So for each term, such as yeast for baking, it shows what was the search prevalence for every of the 50 states plus the District of Columbia. For quarantine workout, you can see it here in green. Yeast for baking, it's here in orange. So after calculating that all together, I was able to determine that these were the two groups. The top 5 states by hobby were Connecticut, Massachusetts, California, New Hampshire, and Utah. The bottom 5 states by hobby were Wyoming, Arkansas, North Dakota, Alaska, and South Carolina. So this graph right here shows that the two groups that were just determined are statistically significantly different groups. So this graph right here shows that the bottom 5 states by hobby were smaller. They had a smaller amount of time in lockdown than the top 5 states by hobby. However, over here, it wasn't really statistically significant. But when you remove the zeros, if you remove all the states that never went into lockdown, and you take out the outliers, then the difference becomes statistically significant. So this graph shows that the bottom 5 states by hobby had much higher mobility. The top 5 states by hobby were out. They were out and about much less. So this graph right here shows that the bottom 5 states by hobby started off with a slightly higher depression rate. Then the top 5 states by hobby goes up. Then it slowly comes down. And by April 2021, it has normalized, and it is actually less than the bottom 5 states by hobby. So here, this next graph, which is a similar thing, just in timeline form. The top 5 states by hobby start off with lefts, they spike, and then they come down lower. So after the initial lockdown, the top 5 states by hobby actually come lower. So this graph is just a zoomed in version of the last one. And here you can see that from 2020 to 2021, the top 5 states by hobby statistically significantly decrease, while the bottom 5 states by hobby do not. So here, this graph just shows that there was really no change in access to healthcare between 2019 to 2020 and 2020 to 2021. So change in access to healthcare was not a confounding factor. So similar thing here, the mobility patterns stay the same, so mobility patterns changing also could not have been a confounding factor. So on to discussion and conclusions. So yes, increased social isolation correlated with higher depression. Also, yes, social isolation correlated with more hobbies. And lastly, yes, more hobbies correlated with less depression. So, some constraints were self-reported depression data. It could have been diagnoses, which may have been more accurate, but it's limited by access to healthcare. The strengths were trends are accurate representation of thought processes, but a weakness could have been that search terms vary over time. Once you foster a dog, you're not going to keep searching for it. And what I learned from this is stay active.